Princess Catherine has just disclosed something about Prince Louis that her team spent months deciding whether to reveal at all. And the reason this matters isn't just what she said, it's that she said anything. This family built an entire framework around silence. Everything shared was measured, timed, controlled.
In raising children today, because it is tough, just making sure they have got the right emotional support around them, and that comes from the adults in their life.
So when Catherine chose to step outside that framework and speak specifically about Louis, something shifted. The question nobody is asking loudly enough is why now? Why him? And what does this detail actually tell us about what was really happening inside that household? For months, the Wales family operated behind a wall of carefully managed silence. And that silence was never accidental. It was a deliberate architecture, built after Catherine's cancer diagnosis in March 2024, fundamentally restructured how the household controlled information. Catherine had undergone abdominal surgery on January 16, 2024. By September, she had completed that course of treatment, though she was quietly clear her path back to full health was long. Then, on January 14, 2025, she announced remission. The world exhaled. Most people assumed the story was closing. It wasn't. Because somewhere inside that same period of recovery, something involving Prince Louis was unfolding that the family had chosen not to address publicly. The pattern became visible to those paying close attention. Louis, previously a consistent presence at royal engagements, was notably absent from occasions where his siblings appeared and he did not. Royal observers began asking why. Routine scheduling? A minor illness? Something the palace simply preferred not to discuss? Sources say the answer is more layered than any of those options suggest. And the person who eventually decided to break the silence wasn't a communications advisor working from a drafted statement. It was Catherine herself. But before she could make that decision, William had already made his own. And his choice is where this story genuinely begins. Sometime in the months following Catherine's surgery, William made a deliberate choice to suspend Louis's participation in public engagements. And critically, he simultaneously refused to allow the palace communications team to issue any explanation for that absence. This created genuine friction inside the household's senior staff. Palace advisors, accustomed to managing public perception with controlled disclosures, reportedly pushed hard for at least a minimal holding line, something anodyne, something that answered the growing questions without revealing anything of substance. William refused, and that refusal was completely deliberate. Why? Because William had watched what happened when the palace tried to manage Catherine's own health story through institutional language. The carefully worded statements, the planned surgery, the slow drip of controlled information that satisfied no one and created a vacuum filled almost entirely by speculation. He wasn't going to let that happen again, not with Louis, not on his watch. So he built a wall. No access, briefings, or explanations, just silence. And whatever was happening with Louis would remain inside those walls for as long as William could hold that position. The question sources were asking inside the palace at this point was not whether William could maintain that wall indefinitely. The question was, what was actually on the other side of it? Because something had changed with Louis. Something serious enough that a father who understood public life chose to withdraw his youngest son from it entirely. Something began with what appeared to be an ordinary childhood illness. What appeared to be an ordinary childhood illness. That framing matters because the word ordinary was doing a great deal of heavy lifting inside Kensington Palace for longer than anyone was comfortable admitting. The timeline, as sources close to the household describe it, begins in the autumn. Louis developed what looked like a standard respiratory infection, the kind every child brings home eventually. Mild fever, a cough, the usual pattern. And for the first week, sources say, nobody inside the household treated it as anything requiring particular attention. But it didn't resolve, it deepened. By the second week, Louis was showing something beyond a seasonal infection. Persistent breathlessness, a fatigue that wasn't moving. The kind of exhaustion that settles into a child's face in a way that parents recognize immediately as something categorically different from tiredness. Catherine, according to sources, was monitoring him closely enough that she was sleeping with the door between their rooms open. Now, the moment sources keep returning to happened during a private Windsor rehearsal for a family engagement. Low-key, internal, nothing publicly scheduled around it. Louis was present, dressed, standing beside Catherine when he reached for her hand. He whispered that he couldn't breathe properly. Sources say Catherine's response in that moment was completely controlled on the outside. But that was the moment, the specific moment, that shifted everything from manageable concern to something she later described privately as the inciting crisis. Because she had spent the previous year learning, in the most intimate possible terms, what it feels like when your body stops cooperating with you. And now, she was watching her youngest child describe something in the same vocabulary. That parallel is what made this genuinely different from ordinary parental worry. It wasn't just a mother's instinct. It was a mother who had walked through a version of this herself and recognized what she was seeing. So what happened inside that household after that moment? Who else was in the room? And what did it do to the two children who witnessed everything but were never once given a formal explanation? Sources suggest that in the weeks following that Windsor rehearsal moment, George and Charlotte were quietly absorbing everything happening around Louis. The lowered voices, the canceled appearances, the way adults in the household shifted the subject whenever either of them walked into a room. Children that age do not process silence as reassurance. They process it as confirmation that something is being hidden from them. And George, according to sources close to the household, acted on that instinct directly. Somewhere around mid-2024, he approached William late one evening and asked him a single question, whether silence about something meant it was dangerous. William did not answer immediately. He couldn't, because the honest answer was complicated in ways a child should not have to carry. Now Charlotte's response was different, quieter, more deliberate. She began leaving handwritten notes beside Louise's bed. Small things, jokes mostly. The kind that only made sense between siblings who had spent every morning of their lives together. Nothing individually alarming. Everything collectively, a 9-year-old's attempt to hold a situation together that she did not have the language to name. What Catherine saw in both of them was the same thing she had been watching in herself for a year. The particular exhaustion of performing normalcy while privately managing something that had no clean resolution. And that is precisely when Louis began drawing his own conclusion about why everything was being kept so quiet. Not that the family was protecting him, that they were ashamed. But Louis didn't arrive at that conclusion suddenly. It built slowly, the way a child assembles meaning from fragments they were never supposed to notice. He had watched the household reorganize itself around something nobody would fully name. He had seen the careful silences when adults shifted conversations as he entered rooms. He had felt the particular quality of cheerfulness that isn't actually cheerful, the kind adults perform when they have decided that protection means concealment. And at some point, he stopped reading the silence as safety. He started reading it as embarrassment. The specific moment Catherine later identified as the turning point was not dramatic. There was no confrontation, no outburst. What she described, according to sources close to the family, was a morning in early spring when Louis quietly refused to take part in a household photograph, not because he was unwell, because, in his own words, he didn't want to be in a picture where everyone was pretending. That one sentence from a 6-year-old stopped Catherine completely, because what Louis had named, with complete accuracy, was exactly what the silence had become: performance, and he had decided he wanted no part of it. Catherine had spent the better part of a year managing the narrative around her own illness with extraordinary precision. She understood better than almost anyone what it cost to curate a public image of resilience while privately navigating something that defies easy resolution. But she had not accounted for the possibility that her youngest child would not just sense the gap between the performance and the reality, but would conclude that the gap existed because something about him, specifically, was being treated as unspeakable. That realization landed harder than anything that had come before it, harder than the diagnosis, harder than the months of institutional pressure to say nothing. Because what Louis had quietly concluded was not just wrong, it was the precise opposite of every reason the silence had been maintained. And Catherine understood in that moment that continuing to say nothing was no longer protecting him, it was damaging him. The only question left was how to break it, and who she would allow to be in the room when she did. And here is where everything that came before it finally breaks open. Because the question Catherine had been sitting with was not whether to speak. She had already resolved that. The question was whether to let the palace machinery shape the words or to step past it entirely. And those two options, on the surface, look like a communications decision. They were not. There was a draft. Sources say a senior advisor had prepared a statement sometime in the days following the moment Catherine identified as the turning point. It acknowledged Louis's difficult period in general terms. It thanked the public for their understanding. It said nothing that could be quoted out of context, nothing that named a feeling, nothing that gave the story anywhere to go. Catherine read it, and she set it down. Now, the mechanics of that decision matter more than they might appear to. When a Princess of Wales steps outside advisor-drafted language, she is not just choosing different words, she is choosing a different relationship with the people listening. The scripted version creates managed distance. What Catherine chose instead collapsed it. She was deliberate about what she included and what she left out. She did not itemize the medical timeline. She did not offer a clinical update or a milestone checklist. What she gave instead was the emotional core of it, that Louis had felt hidden rather than protected, and that she had understood, finally, that the silence she had maintained out of love had landed in him as something closer to shame. She said it in her own voice, the plain statement of what had happened and what she had come to understand. That was the before and after moment. Before it, the family's story was managed. After it, it was hers. But what Catherine may not have fully anticipated was what that choice would trigger inside the palace itself. Because the moment she stepped outside the script, the advisors who had written it were left with a problem. And that is exactly where the story shifts register. Because Catherine stepping outside the script was not just a personal choice. Sources suggest it was experienced inside the palace communication structure as something closer to a controlled detonation. The moment her words went out unmediated, unvetted, emotionally raw in a way that no advisor had cleared, senior aides were left holding a framework that no longer matched the disclosure. The concern was not what she had revealed about Louis specifically. It was the precedent. An unscripted, emotionally personal statement by the Princess of Wales, delivered in her own voice about a child's inner experience, set a standard the institution had spent generations deliberately avoiding. Because if Catherine could speak that way once, the expectation would follow her everywhere after. Now, William understood this. He had been aware of the tension building between Catherine's instinct and the palace machinery well before she spoke, and rather than forcing a resolution, he quietly positioned himself between the two. He did not override Catherine. That matters. He had made clear in the days before her disclosure that this decision was hers to make, but he also absorbed the institutional blowback directly, fielding the concerns of senior advisors who warned that emotionally unmediated royal statements were genuinely difficult to manage once they existed. One source describes his position as essentially becoming the load-bearing wall between Catherine's truth and the palace's need for containment. What the advisors wanted was a clarifying follow-up, something structured, something that would quietly signal the institution was still in control of the narrative. William said no, but whether that boundary held is another question entirely. Because what happened next, when the public actually heard what Catherine had said, was something nobody inside those walls had fully modeled. Within hours of the disclosure, the contrast was already being drawn, loudly and everywhere, between what Catherine had said and every sanitized bulletin the palace had issued across the preceding months. Those bulletins had been carefully worded, institutionally smooth, and emotionally inert. What Catherine offered instead was something the public hadn't received in years of royal communications, something that felt completely unmanaged. The emotional reaction tracked two distinct waves. The first was relief. After months of careful silence, hearing a mother describe what her child had actually experienced landed with an authenticity that standard palace language is deliberately engineered to avoid. The second wave was something closer to reassessment. Because what Catherine had quietly done, without framing it this way herself, was reposition her entire post-remission identity, not as the Princess of Wales re-entering public duty, but as a mother who had been genuinely present for her children through something frightening and who was choosing to say so. That distinction mattered enormously to people watching, and it raised a question the palace hadn't answered, one that goes far deeper than public perception. What does recovery actually mean for a family carrying this much all at once? Now here is the thing about recovery. As a word, it sounds like a destination, a finish line, something you cross and then it's done. That is not what this family is living. Catherine herself was deliberate, almost clinically precise when she described her path back to full health as long. Not difficult, not ongoing, long. That word choice was not accidental. It was a quiet signal to anyone paying attention that what happened to this family over the past 18 months is not something you simply move past. And Louis sits inside that same timeline. Not just as a child who experienced his own health scare, but as a child who watched his mother disappear from public life, return thinner and quieter, and explained to him in age-appropriate language that she was going to be okay, while simultaneously managing his own body's limitations. That is an enormous amount for a 7-year-old to carry. Sources close to the household suggest the weight landed differently on Louis than on his older siblings, precisely because he was processing two fears at once. But here is the structural problem nobody inside the palace has genuinely solved. A royal child cannot recover privately, not completely. The institution eventually requires visible proof of normality. An appearance, a wave, a photograph signaling everything is fine. And that proof actively works against the unhurried, unobserved healing Catherine was describing when she spoke about Louis. The photograph Louis took of his mother for World Cancer Day was beautiful precisely because it was unguarded. A child's eye. What nobody has yet explained is whether that level of unguarded honesty was a one-time release, or whether it opened something inside the palace that someone powerful enough is now determined to close back down. And here is where the story doesn't close. Not the way the palace would prefer. Sources suggest that within days of Catherine's unscripted disclosure about Louis, a senior figure inside the palace structure made their displeasure known, not through a public statement or the press office, but through the kind of quiet, deliberate channel that leaves no fingerprints. The objection, according to those same sources, was not merely procedural. It wasn't about tone or timing, it was about content. Specifically, what Catherine chose to reveal and the precedent that revelation sets for every royal child going forward. The identity of that figure remains unnamed, deliberately so, but the disagreement runs deeper than one unscripted moment. What Catherine did wasn't just speak honestly about Louis. She essentially established that a royal family member can bypass the institutional communications machinery entirely when the emotional stakes feel high enough. And once that door opens, it is genuinely difficult to close. The question nobody inside those walls has answered is whether that unnamed figure has the standing and the will to push back not just informally, but formally, in a way that would force Catherine and William to choose between the family's instinct and the palace's requirements. That choice was made once already. It produced a moment the public won't forget. What happens when someone powerful enough decides it cannot be allowed to happen twice remains, as of now, completely open. The real recovery here was always Catherine's, and Louis was beside her for it. Kate wins visibility. The question of what the children truly carry stays sealed. What scars do they hold in private? This was a family's quiet survival,